Beyond words, the mountain wind blew gently through the pines, carrying with it the fresh scent of moss and damp earth. At the top of a winding path, an elderly Zen master waited at the threshold of his humble wooden cabin. His posture was serene, his gaze like the reflection of a calm lake. From the valley, a scholarly professor ascended with firm steps, his impeccable robe and a determined expression on his face. He had traveled from a distant city to seek answers. His studies in philosophy, logic, and world religions had made him a respected man, but now he longed to understand Zen. Upon reaching the cabin, the professor bowed politely. "Master, I have traveled a long way to learn about Zen. Please, enlighten me with your wisdom." The master looked at him in silence and nodded with a faint smile. Then, without saying a word, he invited him inside. Inside, the room was simple. A worn tatami mat, a low wooden table, and a steaming teapot on the fire. The master pointed to a cushion for the professor to sit on, and calmly began to pour tea into a ceramic cup. The professor watched in silence as the amber liquid filled the cup. His eyes widened in surprise when the tea reached the rim and began to spill, soaking the table. But the master did not stop. "Master!" exclaimed the professor. "The cup is full. Cannot hold more tea." The elder stopped, setting the teapot aside. Then, with a calm voice, he said, "Just like this cup, you are also full. Full of knowledge, opinions, and certainties. If you wish to learn Zen, you must first empty yourself." The professor fell silent. Outside, the wind continued to whisper among the pines. The professor lowered his gaze to the overflowing cup. Tea drops slid across the wooden table, forming small rivers that reflected the dim light of the paper lantern. His mind, accustomed to logical reasoning, searched for an adequate response but found only an unexpected emptiness. "Master," he finally said, "I understand what you're trying to tell me, but how can someone empty their mind? My years of study cannot disappear overnight." The elderly master calmly took his own cup and took a sip of tea before responding. "You do not need to forget what you have learned. What you need is to stop holding on to it." The professor frowned, confused. "But if I let go of what I know, what remains?" The master smiled and pointed to the cup still full of spilled tea. "Take this cup," he said. "Now that it is overflowing, you cannot fill it with more tea. Can you?" The professor nodded. "So what must you do if you want to keep drinking?" The professor sighed, understanding the answer before speaking it aloud. "Empty it." The master nodded with approval and pointed to the open door of the cabin. "Outside this room, there is a path that leads to the mountain's peak. Before we continue discussing Zen, I want you to walk up there and observe everything you encounter on the way. Return when you feel your mind has emptied." The professor hesitated for a moment, but then stood and bowed slightly. "I will do as you ask, master." Without further questions, he left the cabin and began walking along the path, leaving behind the still warm cup of tea. The path rose among the pines, narrow and covered with dry leaves that crunched under the professor's steps. He walked with a furrowed brow, his mind still trapped in the enigma the master had posed. How does one empty the mind? As he ascended, his mind continued to fill with thoughts. He reflected on his knowledge, reviewed philosophical texts, and tried to find a logical answer. But each thought was like another drop of tea in his overflowing cup. Soon, he reached a clearing where a stream wound between the rocks. He stopped and gazed at the clear water. It flowed effortlessly, adapting to each obstacle without resistance. "The water does not cling to anything," he thought. "It just flows." He knelt by the stream and dipped his hands into the cold water. He watched as the liquid slipped through his fingers, unable to hold on to it. At that moment, he understood something subtle. The more he tried to cling to a thought, the more elusive it became. He sighed and continued his journey. As he ascended, he began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The sound of the wind through the trees, the distant song of a bird, the way sunlight filtered through the branches. For the first time in a long while, he stopped thinking and simply observed. When he finally reached the summit, he was met with a breathtaking view. From there, the entire valley spread out before him, covered in morning mist. He sat on a rock and, for the first time, did not try to analyze what he saw. He just breathed. He was simply present. And in that instant, he felt his mind empty. The professor remained seated on the mountaintop for a long time. He didn't know how long he had been there, nor did he care. Something inside him had subtly changed, though he could not explain it with words. The wind blew gently, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to fill it with thoughts. He simply breathed and let the breeze surround him. Finally, he stood up and began his way back to the cabin. His steps were lighter, and though his mind was not completely empty, it no longer weighed as it had before. When he arrived, he found the master exactly where he had left him, sitting serenely by the tea table. Without saying a word, the elder gestured for him to sit. The master poured tea once more, but this time, the professor received it with attention, watching as the liquid elegantly filled the cup. When the cup was full, the master set the teapot aside and looked at the professor with a calm smile. "Tell me, have you emptied your mind?" The professor looked at his cup of tea, then at the master. He remembered the flowing river, the wind that clung to nothing, the view from the mountaintop. "Not completely," he replied honestly, "but I believe I have begun to understand." The master nodded in satisfaction. "That is enough for now. When the cup is empty, it can be filled again. But remember, Zen is not something learned through words. It is experienced, it is lived." The professor took a sip of his tea. This time, he didn't try to analyze its flavor or compare it to others he had tasted before. He simply drank it, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly present in that moment. The warmth of the tea slid down his throat, leaving a trail of warmth that spread through his body. It wasn't an extraordinary taste, nor an especially exotic aroma, but in that moment, the professor felt as though he had never before drunk a cup of tea with true attention. The master watched him silently, with the same patience with which one contemplates the passing of the seasons. "When you arrived here," the elder said, "you were full of knowledge but empty of understanding. You wanted to learn Zen, but you brought with you an unnecessary burden." The professor nodded slowly. "I always believed that learning meant accumulating more information, more ideas, more answers. But at the top of the mountain, something changed." The master smiled slightly. "Tell me, what did you see up there?" The professor pondered for a moment before answering. "At first, I only saw the landscape, the mountains, the trees, but then something happened. I stopped naming what I saw. I stopped analyzing each thing. I was simply there, nothing more." The master nodded in approval. "That is the first step. See without naming, listen without judging, exist without clinging." The professor took another sip of tea, now feeling the warmth of the cup in his hands, the faint aroma rising with the steam. He realized that, for the first time, he wasn't trying to understand Zen with his intellect. He was living it, even if only for a fleeting moment. The master refilled his cup and asked in a calm voice, "Now tell me, what flavor does this tea have?" The professor looked at the cup, smiled slightly, and replied, "It tastes exactly as it is." The master laughed softly and nodded. "Then, now we can begin." The professor looked at the master with curiosity. "If we can now begin, what is the first thing I should do?" The master set the teapot aside and pointed to the open window. Outside, the wind continued swaying the pine branches, and the sound of the foliage was like a constant murmur. "Listen to the wind," the master said. The professor lowered his head and closed his eyes for a moment. "I hear it," he replied. "Good." The master nodded. "Now tell me, what is it saying?" The professor furrowed his brow. He concentrated more on the sound, trying to find some meaning in the whisper of the leaves. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "I just hear the wind." The master smiled. "Exactly. The wind says nothing, yet you hear it. That is Zen. It is not something you must understand with words. It is something that simply is." The professor fell silent, absorbing those words. The master continued, "Throughout your life, you have tried to fill your mind with meanings, with explanations, with answers. But Zen is not a concept that can be captured by logic. It is like the wind. You can feel it, but you cannot possess it." The professor looked again out the window. He observed the branches moving, listened to the sound of the wind, and for the first time stopped trying to understand it. He simply listened, and in that instant, something inside him expanded. It wasn't an answer, nor a conclusion, just a feeling of lightness, as if the wind had passed through him, carrying away a part of his old self. The master watched him silently and nodded with satisfaction. "Very well," he said. "Now let us drink more tea." The professor took the cup in his hands and drank silently. He didn't think about the taste, nor the temperature, nor whether it was better or worse than other times. He simply drank. The master watched him with a peaceful smile. "Tell me," he asked after a moment, "how has the tea changed since the last time you drank it?" The professor pondered the question. He looked at the amber liquid in his cup, feeling its warmth in his hands. Then he smiled slightly. "The tea hasn't changed," he replied. "I have changed." The master nodded in approval. "That's right. The world is the same, but your eyes are no longer the same." The professor set the cup on the table and took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he felt that he didn't need an answer for everything. He didn't need to understand everything with his mind. "Master," he said after a moment, "I have always lived searching for knowledge, believing that the truth was in words, in books, in explanations. But now—" He paused for a moment, searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. The master looked at him calmly and completed his thought. "Now you see that the truth does not need to be explained." The professor nodded. "The tea is just tea. The wind is just wind. I am just I." The master smiled. "When you arrived here, you were full. Now, even though you are not completely empty, you have made space for something new. And that is enough." The professor looked at his cup, then at the master. His mind, for the first time in a long time, was at peace. "Thank you, master." The elder nodded and, with a calm gesture, refilled the cups. "Let us drink more tea." The tea steamed gently in the cups, and the professor watched it without haste. There were no more questions in his mind, nor a pressing need for answers. He was simply there in that moment, sharing tea with the master. The elder took a sip and looked at the professor with a tranquil expression. "Tell me," he asked, "do you now know what Zen is?" The professor thought for a moment. He would have once tried to construct an elaborate answer, perhaps based on some philosophical treatise or his vast academic knowledge. But now words seemed unnecessary. He smiled slightly and replied, "I don't know." The master let out a soft laugh, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. "Very well," he said. "Now we begin to understand each other." The professor laughed too. Inside, he felt a lightness he had never experienced before. Not knowing was no longer a burden, but a liberation. The master set his cup on the table and looked at the horizon, where the sun began to descend behind the mountains. Zen is not something that can be possessed, he continued. It is not a knowledge you can store in your mind like a book on a shelf. It is the water that flows, the wind that blows, the tea you drink. It is in everything and in nothing at the same time. The professor looked at his own cup and saw his reflection in the surface of the amber liquid. Then, calmly, he took another sip. "So, what should I do now?" he asked. The master smiled. "Keep drinking tea. Keep walking. Keep breathing." The professor nodded. He didn't need any more explanations. And for the first time in his life, he understood without needing to understand. The professor sat in silence, holding his cup with both hands. The warmth of the tea transferred to his fingers, and he felt his body relax even further. The master watched him calmly and then pointed to the open door of the cabin. "You came seeking answers," he said. "But Zen doesn't give you answers. It only shows you what is already in front of you." The professor followed the direction of the master's gaze. Outside, the sun tinged the sky with orange and violet hues. The wind continued to sway the trees, and the sound of a branch cracking in the distance filled the air. "Before," the master continued, "you would have tried to explain the color of the sky with words. You would have wanted to analyze the sound of the wind. But tell me, what do you see now?" The professor looked at the landscape and let out a slight smile. "I see the sky, the wind, and the trees," he replied. "But I don't try to name them. I simply see them." The master nodded with satisfaction. "That is true learning. It's not about accumulating knowledge, but about letting go of what you don't need." The professor took another sip of tea, feeling its warmth spread through his body. He realized that, by letting go of the need for answers, his mind had become lighter, more open, more present. For the first time, he didn't feel the urgency to know everything. And in that absence of urgency, he found something deeper than any academic teaching. Peace. The master slowly stood up and looked at the professor with a serene expression. "The tea is finished," he said, "and you are also ready to continue your path." The professor nodded, feeling that those words were not a farewell, but an invitation to keep living with a new perspective. He stood up, bowed deeply, and, without needing more words, left the cabin. The wind brushed his face as he descended the mountain, and this time he didn't try to understand it. He simply felt it. The path back was clearer than ever. Each step the professor took resonated on the ground covered with dry leaves. But there was no rush in his walk anymore. The fresh mountain air surrounded him, and the sound of his breathing intertwined with the whisper of the wind. During the ascent, he had sought answers, had wished to understand. But now, as he descended, he realized that everything he had needed had always been within him, in his ability to be present. The master's cabin was behind him, its small figure in the distance, like a fleeting mark in his mind. But the lesson endured, not as knowledge, but as a deep sense of connection to the moment. The sun had already begun to set, tinting the horizon with soft, warm colors. The landscape unfolded before him, full of life, silence, and simplicity. Nothing needed to be understood because everything was in its place. The professor reached the foot of the mountain and paused for a moment, observing the world around him. A slight smile appeared on his face, a smile without haste, without judgment, just a reflection of the peace that had begun to root itself inside him. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, and continued on his way. He no longer sought nor desired to understand. He simply lived, and in that living, he had found the essence of Zen.